Hi everyone, this is a video about chapter 10, which is about externalities. This is a book of Gregory Mankiw, Principles of Economics. So basically what we have worked before, it was about the law of demand and supply, how the markets behaves. Okay, how the markets behave is what we have what we saw before. Now in this chapter we're going to talk about externality. So this is really interesting because unfortunately markets, when we have supply and demand, the markets, they don't capture all the information that they have to. So in this case the invisible hand is kind of not omnipotent. So invisible hand, just the market by themselves, they cannot fix everything. So markets do many things well, but not everything. So this is the case of externalities. So remember from the chapter 1, which was about the 10 principles of economics, we have talked about the government. Okay, so the role that the government has in the market, and one of these principles says government can sometimes improve market outcomes. So this is what I want to talk about, how externalities, they are not captured by the market, and how the government can reallocate in some way resources in order to arrive to better results. So in this case, when we are talking about markets, they sometimes fail to allocate resources efficiently. So in this sense, the government they can do, like throughout policies, they can potentially improve the market's allocation. So we have to start, and we have to understand this point very clear. An externality, this arises when a person engages in an activity that influences the well-being of a bystander, and yet neither pays nor receives a compensation for that effect. So what does it mean? Basically it means that when there is some transaction between the consumers and producers, there are bystanders. Those bystanders, they are not part of the markets, they are outside. Think about people that live really close to concerts, for example. So obviously the market of the concerts is just about the artists that they perform there and the public that they pay for the tickets. But the bystanders, in this case, they are people that they live close to the stadium. I think that most of them, they really don't like to be close to this really noise place, all people littering, all the garbage, all the mess that the concert produces. So those are the bystanders. They are not part of the market, but they are affected in negative way in this case, but can be affected in positive way. Some of them, maybe they can listen to the music and they love that. So maybe it could be externality positive for these people, that they enjoy the concert, and they people that they can't stand being there, they can be like negative externality. We are going to explain this more detail afterwards. So we know that if the impact on the bystander is adverse, as the concert, as I say before, all the noise, all people littering, all people shouting, so this is called negative externality. On the other side, when we have the impact of the bystanders is beneficial, this is called positive externality. So it could be the case of people that they are close to the concert, but they listen to the music and they enjoy it. So it could be a positive externality. So in the analysis of externalities, it's important to take into account that we pay attention not only to the consumer producer surplus as we studied before. There is a third party here, which is not the government. The third party, they are the bystanders. So it is relevant the surplus or benefit of the society. So as a whole, there's going to be consumers, producers, and bystanders, people that are affected because of the market, okay, in positive or in negative way. So we have how the buyers and sellers, they neglect the external effects and the actions when deciding how much produce or buy. So in this case, the market equilibrium is not efficient when there are externalities. As I said before, for example, in a concert, the artists that perform, people that they go inside to the stadium, they don't care, between quotation marks, about other people, about bystanders. So when you decide the equilibrium price and the quantities that are in the market, that are supplied and bought, you see how bystanders, they are out of this issue. They are not important for this part. So in order to understand better about externalities, I'm going to explain the positive and negative examples of externalities. So for example, a positive one. So when you have like historic buildings and people repair them, people paint the facades, people change the windows, people paint them. So absolutely, when you walk around there, you feel satisfaction in some way. You feel like reward. Imagine that you like belong to a city that the downtown is really awful. So for example, in my case in Bogota, the capital of Colombia, so the downtown have been transformed throughout the last years. So I have seen how the buildings, they have transformed. So you walk there and you feel like better place, okay, because it's beautiful. So this is a positive externality. How come? Because people that they reform the buildings, they won't receive any cent, any money from my part, because I'm just looking them. Okay, this is a positive externality to me. Okay, so for this example, you understand a little bit why the government try to compensate the effort of the construction companies or reformer companies, giving kind of subsidy. So you start to understand how when there is a positive externality, it's good for not only from people from the market, but for bystander, but also for bystanders as well. So when it's positive, it's good for everyone. So for this reason, you can see how subsidies, they are really encouraged in these cases. Now let's go to the other part. Let's go to the negative externalities. So market of automobiles. Definitely everybody knows, but everybody doesn't know how much, but everybody knows how is the bad impact to the environment with the cars. So for this reason, you will see how government, they make kind of taxes to gasoline, which is really high, in order to encourage people to use public transportation, move with bike. Okay, so you see here the other case, when there is a negative externality, there are taxes, because it's not good for everybody, this kind of pollution. So for this reason, there is going to be taxes. Another example of negative, barking dogs. So when you, for example, you live in a building where there is a really barking dogs or really annoying dog, you see how it is a negative externality, because you are like, you want to lie down, take a nap, but you cannot because you listened out of the sudden how a dog start to bark. So this is a negative externality. The neighbor, obviously, he or she doesn't care about that, but you receive the noise. Okay, so for this reason, it's a negative externality, and obviously is not is neglected by the dog owner. So for this reason, local governments address this problem by making it illegal to disturb the peace. So there is you have like kind of laws, the kind of rules that you have to follow in order to live in a building. So you have to avoid your dog that it is barking all day. Another positive, this is about research into new technologies. So as everybody knows, for example, the giant Apple, as they developed the touch screen, so definitely another companies took this new invention in order to develop this touch screen to their companies. So absolutely this is considered kind of a spillover. Okay, how technology makes another competitors to create new ideas based on the leader in this case. So this is good. So for this reason there are subsidies. So in this case it's not kind of a subsidy, but it's kind of beneficial from the government to the inventors. So this is called patent. So when you have a new idea, you have like some years that you can take advantage of your invention, and you can be like you have just the policy, the monopoly, in order to explode this idea. And this is why how the government make incentives in order to promote innovation, because otherwise researchers, inventors, they won't have like incentive enough in order to make inventions, because once they create, other people copy, and they cannot have the benefits of that. So we are going to talk a little bit about the welfare economics, just a recapitulation. So we are going to work with the aluminium market. So we know, as we remember, we have seen the previous chapter, that the demand curve from aluminium reflects the value of aluminium to consumers, how consumers perceive or how much they are willing to pay in order to consume X tons of aluminium. So this is the willing to pay. So remember, there is downward slope, basically because higher price you don't want to consume that, but if it's a lower price you maybe will have more incentive to do it. So in the other case we have the supply curve. The supply curve, it reflects the cost of producing aluminum. So the height of the supply curve shows the cost of marginal solder. So basically is the other case is kind of the other case from the consumer side, because we have upward slope where the higher price make producers put more in the market, supply more, and the opposite, when the price is low, producers, they don't have incentives enough in order to produce that. So for this reason they don't produce, or they don't put in the market high quantities. So remember, when there is no government, basically the price adjusts to balance just for the forces of the market from the supply and demand side, no more. There is no intervention. So think about the aluminum market. We have the supply. It's important that we are introducing in this chapter the private cost. Okay, this is just the supply, which is the cost of the company. Okay, and here is the demand, which is the private value, so people inside the market. So we have here, as usual, Q and P star, which reflects where is like the market is empty. I mean, when the quantity demanded is exactly the same as the supply offered, okay, or the quantity supplied. So here Remember, this is the point where there is the maximum, what is the maximum value of the consumer surplus and producer surplus. Remember that the consumer surplus, this is this triangle. Remember that throughout this or along this part of the curve, there are several consumers that are willing to pay even a higher value for this good. But they don't have to. They have to pay just P star. So this is kind of saving from the consumer side. On the other side, we have this triangle, which is basically the producer surplus. There are a lot of producers that are along this curve. They are willing to supply even to these prices, which are lower than P star. But due to the equilibrium price, they don't have to offer to these prices. They can offer to P star. So there's kind of profits. So this triangle is considered the producer surplus as a measure of the welfare of the producers, and consumer surplus as the measure of welfare of consumers. So let's think about negative externalities in production. So when we are talking about production, we need to talk about supply curve. So as you know, these kind of metals, this kind of high industry, they produce several problems as pollution, for example. So suppose that is pretty much real. Aluminum factories emit pollution. So for each unit of aluminum produced, a certain amount of smoke enters the atmosphere. So the cost of society of producing aluminum is larger than the cost to the aluminum producers. Why? So remember, as we analyzed before, we have thought just about the market from the producer side, but we haven't thought about the bystanders, because bystanders, they have to receive the pollution from the factories. The cost of society is larger than the private cost, than the supply, okay, which is the private cost. So for each unit of aluminum produced, the social cost includes the private cost of the aluminum producers plus the cost of bystanders adversely affected by the pollution. So remember, when there is a bad effect, or there is let's say something bad that affects the supply curve, remember that the supply curve shifts to the left. So in this point, what I want to emphasize is that with the presence of pollutions inside the production, the supply curve, so the real cost, not just the private one, but the real cost, has to shift to the left. And this gap between the private cost and the social cost, this gap, this spread, is the size of the externality. So let's think about what I said graphically in order to be more clear. So we have here the supply, as I said before, the private cost, so it doesn't take into account the externality. We have the demand, the private value. Remember that we are talking about negative externality in production. So we have here the Q market, a P market of equilibrium. So as I said before, there is this supply, which is real the social cost, because this private cost, this is not the total cost of the society, because people, they have to receive all the pollution from this company. So this difference, this gap, as I said before, this is the cost of pollution. This is the real cost. So once we are incorporating, or we are introducing better, the social cost, we will find here the optimum Q. So we see here how the Q market is not the optimum one, because this supply curve, it doesn't reflect the cost of the society of pollution. So for this reason, the Q optimum is going to be less than the Q market. So this is going to be the optimum, the one which get together social cost with the demand. So what quantity of aluminum should be produced? It's going to be this Q optimum, and it appears the social planner figure. So what does the social planner figure? Usually, as a social planner, we can think about the government, which can make some way in order to move or reallocate resources from this point to this point. So this path is going to be made by, or is going to be created by the social planner, someone who knows which is the real value of the externality, and someone that can make interventions. So most of the cases it is the government. So the idea is to maximize the total surplus derived from the market. So the welfare before, it was this triangle and this triangle, but now with this market is going to be this and this. You can think that is lower than before, but here we are taking into account the bystanders. This is called internalize an externality. So we are internalizing the externality, and bystanders, they will be benefit, or they will be, yes, they will receive a benefit for that. So the idea is that the planner would choose the level of aluminum production and which the demand curve cross the social cost curve. So this part, as I said before. So planner does not produce more than this level, because the social cost of producing additional aluminum excess the value of consumers. So automatically, when the social planner say, okay, you can produce more than this Q optimum, this is going to be a difference between the supply and the demand. So it's going to be automatically, there's going to be like more demand than the supply of this part. It's going to be like scarcity from the demand part, okay, because it is not attended by the supply. So in this case, it's going to be this, okay, the optimum one. So continue talking about the negative externalities in production. So there are different ways in order to reallocate resources in order to arrive to the optimum. Okay, so one way to reach this optimum is to tax aluminum. So remember that when you tax some good, automatically it doesn't matter if it's the producers or the consumers, because it's going to be split by them depending on the elasticity. Okay, so in this case what we have here is like the tax would shift the supply curve for aluminum upward by the size of the tax, getting closer to the social cost. So the use of this tax is called internalizing the externality. So we are trying to make the company that it doesn't neglect the presence of the externality, because kind of hurt them a little bit. So when they internalize, automatically in this case they have to pay something to pollute, so they cannot produce as before because they have to pay for that. So for this reason they will take into account the price that they have to pay for each ton produced before of polluting. So now we're going to talk about the other case, the positive externalities in production. So in this case, the social cost is less than the private cost. So remember, in this case, the first situation, as we analyzed before in the previous chapters, it was just about the private cost. Now in externalities, we take into account the bystanders, so it means the social cost. In the example before, we saw how the social cost was higher, so for this reason it's better to put a tax. In this case, you will see how the social cost is lower, so in this case is in the right, so it would be better to subsidize in order to maximize the welfare not only for consumers and suppliers or producers, but also for the bystanders. So externality benefits bystanders. As an example, we will work with industrial robots. So remember, when there is a technological advance, they act as a spillover. So maybe some companies, they can copy, or they can have new ideas in order to develop their own robots. So imagine that there is a new design that benefits not only the firm but also the society. So this is called, as I said before, a technology spillover. So we are going to talk about this technology spillover and the social optimum. So we have here the social cost as usual, and we have the demand, is the private. So here, let me think better. Okay. So here is the sorry, this is not complete. Okay, why? Because this one, the supply private cost is this one, okay, and the social cost is this one. So it's like upside down. So it's gonna be social cost is gonna be around here. So here you see here how different from the previous case, the social cost is lower than this private cost. So the optimum, this one, is going to be the value of the technology spillover. So this one is going to be optimum quantities. So this is really interesting because, as we saw before, the robots market, the price was this one, the quantity was this one. But if we make in some way internalize this positive externality, it would be a lower price and a more quantities into the market. So for this reason, positive externalities, they have to be incentive. And how government incentive them? Usually by subsidies. So here we have the optimum. So in this case, again, the role or the figure of the social planner would choose to produce a larger quantity of robots than the private market does. So government can internalize the externality by subsidizing the production of robots. So here, to ensure that a market equilibrium equals the social optimum, the subsidy should equal the value of technology spillover. So you have to be this gap, this difference have to be reached by a subsidy from the government side. So we already talked about positive and negative externalities from the producer side. Now we're going to talk about externalities in consumption. So, as for example, consumption of alcohol. So you know how people who drive when they are drunk, they are likely to cause accidents. So definitely this is going to be a negative externality, because no one can internalize your driving at 2 a.m. but you haven't drank anything, any alcohol beverage, but it's someone who is completely drunk and crash on you and you die and you have some problems. So definitely this is a negative externality in consumption of alcohol. On the other side, we have the positive one. We have the consumption in education. So we know as more educated population leads to better governments. When people is more educated, we can have more progress and we can finish to a better government. So we have here as example, we're going to summarize both in the same slide. So we have here the demand, private value, and here we need to move the demand because we are talking about consumption externalities. So as a negative externality, the real cost or the real demand should be this one. Okay, So in this case, this is going to be the quantity optimum. Okay, so a negative externality as alcohol. So for this reason, there are several punishments for people that they drive drunk. So this is going to be tax. Remember, when it's a negative externality, there are going to be taxes, and when there is a positive, it's going to be subsidies. In the other case, we have here the education, for example, the demand, but the real demand of education is going to be this one. Okay, so this one is going to be the social value. So the price is going to be higher and the quantity is going to be higher. So in this case, it's going to be sponsorized in some way by subsidies to education. So externalities in consumption. So with a negative externality, social value is less than the private value, as we saw before. Social optimal quantity is smaller than the quantity determined by the private market. So as we saw before, the demand is like here. This one, so the quantities are lower. In this case, the social value is lower. What people really want is lower people consumer alcohol than the market decides. Okay, so this is the case. So when it's a positive consumption, social value is greater than the private value, and the social optimal quantity is greater than the quantity determined by the private market. So as we saw before, the quantity determined by the private market is lower than what people really want. People in society in general want more quantity of education. So here the government can correct the market failure by inducing market to internalize the externality. So how does the government do that? So to move the market to equilibrium, or to optimum better, is necessary a tax for negative and a subsidy for positive. So negative externalities in production of consumptions led markets to produce larger quantity than is socially desirable. So more pollution, more alcohol. And positive externalities in production or consumption leads markets to produce smaller quantity than socially desirable. So as for example, the education or the restore of buildings, for example. So in this case, to internalize the problem, the government can internalize the externality by taking goods that have negative externalities, that by taxing, okay, and subsidizing goods that have positive externalities. So how the private solution to externalities? So before we saw a little bit how the government, they can arrange in some way and reallocate resources. But the government is not the unique party or the unique solution to externalities, because public and private solutions want to reallocate resources to social optimum. So not only government can provide solutions, private can do it as well. So some solutions are reached by with moral codes and social sanctions. So for example, think about why most people don't litter. So you don't litter, actually, if you are part of these people that think like that, you don't litter because maybe you're going to be punished by someone. No, basically you don't litter because you know that is bad, that is not good, is not moral, and someone can judge you, and not only that, but you feel bad littering the street because it's going to be bad for the environment, it's going to be bad looking, and maybe this is going to block the places where the water goes, and maybe can be a cause of floods. So for these reasons you don't litter, but most people don't litter because it's wrong thing to do, you know. But or another thing, or the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. So you don't make like hurt someone because you don't like that someone hurts you. So for this reason, this is like a solution of externalities. This is the how people can bridge. So other parts could be, for example, a non-profit organizations. They receive funds to protect, for example, the environment. So maybe there are some problems, but there is a third party that takes care of that. But they are not inside of the market. But private, like people, donate some resources in order to make someone who take care from the environment in some way. So sometimes between the same markets, they can help them each other. So we can just like arrive to an agreement and it will be okay. For example, if we have an apple grower and a beekeeper, and think about they are located next to each other, they are just like together. So when you have pollinating the flowers on the trees, the bees use the nectar they get from the apple trees to produce honey. So then when they internalize, both produce more. They can eventually sign a contract. So what does it mean? Imagine that you don't care about the beekeeper from the other, your neighbor, and the beekeeper doesn't care about the apple grower. So they produce X quantities of apples and they raise X quantities of bees. But if they make an agreement, they can even produce more, because more flowers they can be pollinator, and there's going to be more apples and more bees. So this is going to be how private people, they can get to an agreement. So for this reason, we are going to start to talk about the Coase theorem. So in this case, if private parties can bargain without costs over the allocation of resources, they can solve the problem of externalities on their own. So beekeeper, apple grower, they can talk together and they can achieve better results. So in the other case, let's think about a person who has a dog, which this dog barks and disturbs the neighbor. So naturally the owner dog is happy because he or she owns the dog, but the neighbor is not as happy as the other one. So this is a negative externality. So what is the solution? So let's think about the solution social efficient. So imagine that there is a social planner with two alternatives. Compared from one side, the social planner compares the benefit of owner dog and the benefit of the neighbor, or the, let's say, not the benefits, but the prejudice of the neighbor. So if the benefit exceeds the cost of the neighbor, it is efficient for owner dog to keep the pet. If the cost is higher than the benefit, owner dog has to get rid of the dog. So according to the Coase theorem, neighbor can offer to pay owner dog to get rid of it. So just owner dog will accept if the benefit is higher than the benefit of keeping his dog. So for example, the neighbor, he can't stand listening the dog. So he or she talks to the other one respectfully and says, okay man, I don't like your dog, but I will pay you $200 in order you to get rid of it. Okay, so just the owner dog will take this money just in the case that this money received is higher than the benefit is received by the dog. Okay, so they have to bargain over the price and they can reach an agreement. So in this case, suppose that two parties are trying to reach an agreement. So from one side, the owner dog has a benefit of $500. So this is the benefit. I know that this is like assumption. It's really hard to measure everything in money, but this is going to be, let's assume that it's possible that you can say, okay, owner the dog is my benefit of $500, and the neighbor, the cost is $800. So as you notice, there is opportunity to be better off from both sides. Why? Because the neighbor, for example, can offer him 600, so it could be kind of benefit of 200, because the cost of leasing the beauty dog is 800. And in the other case, in this case, the both parties are better off, an efficient outcome is reached. But there could be another point. Imagine that the cost price is lower than the benefit. So in this case, the owner basically keep the dog, and those results are still efficient, because for the neighbor it's not a good idea to pay more than the cost of listening the dog. So it's interesting that before, or when we are talking about this case, we are assuming that the owner dog has the right to keep it. So what about if the neighbor has the legal right to peace and quiet? So in this there is a new rule. There are distribution of the right is relevant, because it depends on who has the right. Okay, so in this it determines who has to pay to who. So whether owner dog or a neighbor has the right of barking, of the barking and dog, and peace and quiet respectively. So it defines who pays to whom. So if the guy has the legal right to keep the dog, they have to receive money from the neighbor. But if the neighbor has the legal right to peace and quiet, the owner of the dog have to pay something to him in order to keep the dog. So this is the important conclusion of the Coase theorem. So private economic actors can solve the problems of externalities among themselves. So they don't need a third party to solve the problem. Whatever the initial distribution of rights, the interest parties can always reach a bargain in which everyone is better off and the outcome is efficient. But why private solutions do not always work? It's not as easy as the situation before, because this is really common how private actors on their own, they often fail to resolve or to solve the problems caused by externalities. So the Coase theorem only apply when interested parties have no trouble reaching and enforcing an agreement. When there is trouble, when you go to the owner of the dog and say, please shut up this dog, and the other say, I don't care, and I'm gonna still keep the dog, and there is not any agreement, and actually the dog start to bark even louder, like louder. So this is gonna be impossible, the Coase theorem. And actually you can think about transactional costs. So sometimes the costs of the parties incurring the process of agreeing to and following through on a bargain. So for example, imagine that you have to go to talk with the guy doesn't answer, you don't have time, you have stuff, you have really a lot of things to do, so it's impossible. So as an example, let's think about different languages. So lawyers, different languages, so you have to assume the cost of maybe an interpreter, translator. So you don't say, okay, I don't want to talk with this guy because we have different languages, we have different cultures, it's so hard to communicate each other. So this is going to be transactional cost. And in this case, when the private does not reach any bargain, so government play a role. So there are like basically two points how the government they can intervene in the market. So the first one is the command and control policies, which they regulate behavior directly. So government basically say to the owner of the dog, say, sorry, you cannot keep the dog. if the dog continues to bark all day. The other solution from the government could be the market-based policies, which provide incentives so that private decisions markets will choose the problem on their own. So we're still talking about regulation. So these command and control policies, they are called regulation. So it's how the market-based policies provide incentives so that private decision market will choose to solve the problem on their own. So government, through regulation, they can make some behaviors required or forbidden. So as an example, it is a crime to dump poisonous chemicals into a water supply. So the external costs to society far exceed the benefit to polluter. So remember, the social cost is shift to the left to the private supply. So in this case, the government institutes a command and control policy, which means regulate, that prohibits this act altogether. In practice, the situation is not as simple. You cannot avoid all pollution. Sometimes the regulation has to be based on different analysis. You cannot go to a company and say, okay, you cannot pollute, and the company is closed. This is not like as easy as that. So for this reason, we have another point where the government can use is the Pigovian taxes and subsidies. So government can do another intervention, so different from regulation. They can internalize externality, taking activities that are negative externalities and subsidize positive externalities in order to reallocate resources and in order to arrive to the optimum. So the taxes enacted to correct the effects of negative externalities, they are called Pigovian taxes. Why? Because after economics actor Pigot proposed this kind of mechanism to eliminate externality. So as an example, suppose two factories, a paper mill and a steel mill. Okay, a producer of paper and a producer of steel. Imagine that are each dumping 500 tons of globe, okay, this kind of the waste of the production from paper or steel, into a river each year. So the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, decides that it wants to reduce the amount of pollutions. So it considers two solutions. First, with regulation, as we saw before. So the regulation could be like the EPA, okay, could tell each factory to reduce its pollution to 300 tons of globe per year. Or the Pigovian tax, that the EPA could levy on a tax on each factory of $50,000 for each ton of globe it emits. So here both policies, they are addressed to eliminate or reduce the externality of the waste of globe, but one is different than the other one. The first one, they are fixing the quantity that you can pollute or you can produce, and the other make automatically a fine or a tax of 50,000 for each ton of globe it emits. So the great question, which solution is better? So there is no like economics, there is no absolute truth, but most economists would prefer the tax, because the higher tax, there is going to be the larger reduction in pollution. The tax reduces more efficiently the level of pollution. On the other case, you have to think about, in the market analysis before, we saw how the taxes, they distort incentives and move allocation of resources away from the social optimum. But with externalities is another history, because with externalities, society also cares about the well-being of the bystanders who are affected. So they maybe they lose some quantities, prices, or there's going to be some loss of consumer and producer surplus, but it's kind of transfer to the bystanders that they were neglected before. So Pigovian taxes correct incentives for the presence of externalities and thereby move the allocation of resources closer to the social optimum. Remember, taxes for negative externalities and subsidies for positive externalities. So in this there is a new market because we can think about tradable pollution permits. So how does it work? So imagine that the EPA they adopt the regulation of a limit of 300 tons of gold per year, and there are two companies, the paper and the steel mill. So they have a proposal. So they talk each other. So the steel mill wants to increase its emission of gold by 100 tons. And the other case, the paper mill has agreed to reduce its emission by the same amount if the steel mill pays it $5 million. So should the EPA allow the two factories to make this deal? So this thing, you see how the producers in this market, they can start to talk. So in this case there is kind of a new market, the new market of the tradable pollution permits. So from the standpoint of economic efficiency, allowing the deal is a good policy because there's going to be there is not going to be violated the maximum quantity of 300 tons, and instead of that it could be like the opportunity cost from the company that is going to reduce the production is higher, receiving these $5 million. So the deal must make the owners of the two factories better off because they are voluntarily agreeing on it. And this deal doesn't have any external effects because the quantity of pollution is still the same as the maximum permitted. So, but in this case we have created a new market. This new market, this new scarce resource is called pollution permits because there is a price for polluting. So with Pigovian taxes, polluting firms must pay a tax to the government. With pollution permits, polluting firms must pay to buy the permit to the other company. So this is the difference. And the result, the cost of polluting is what they could have received by selling these permits. So here we have the graph, how the Pigovian and the demand. So this is the Pigovian tax. So this one is no more the demand of the pollution, but this is the demand for pollution rights. If the pollution rights, the price is lower, so it means that companies they pollute more, and the equilibrium is this one. To this Pigovian tax, the quantity of pollution to be this one. Okay, and in the other case, when we are talking about pollution permits, we know that the supply of pollution permits is fixed because there is just a maximum quantity of pollution. So this is going to be supply, and the demand is going to be this one, and this price of this market is going to be the equivalent to the Pigovian tax. Okay, so what is the objection to the economic analysis of production? So it's normal that some people don't agree that it's enough to put price for the contamination. So it means if you have money you can pollute. So this is the main objection. This is not, it doesn't matter the efficiency, it doesn't matter the optimum. What we are doing is that we are running out our planet. But as we know, there is kind of a trade-off, because trying to eliminate all pollution would reverse many of technological advances that allow us to enjoy a high standard of living. So I guess that even some environmentalists or some people that they are against the technological advance, they have some like facilities. So in this sense, it's not like efficient to have complete clean. There is kind of a trade-off. So this is basically that I wanted to say in this chapter. So I hope it has worth. I hope you can grasp a little bit the idea, and we will see in the next video that we are solving all the problems of the chapter. Have a great day, great night, continue with economics, great success. Bye bye.